For 40 years, one man lived where almost no one else dared to stay. His nearest neighbor was miles away. His closest companion was the endless sound of crashing waves against unforgiving rocks. Every morning, he climbed the same spiral staircase. Every evening, he lit the same beacon that guided strangers safely home. Thousands of sailors trusted the light he kept alive, yet almost none of them ever knew his name. While cities grew, wars began and ended, technology transformed the world. He remained exactly where he had always been, standing alone at the edge of the sea. Many believed Lighthouse keepers simply watched the ocean, but the truth was very different. They battled violent storms that could erase entire coastlines overnight. They faced isolation so complete that weeks could pass without hearing another human voice. They carried the responsibility of hundreds of lives every single night. One mistake, one forgotten lamp, one failed signal, and entire ships could disappear beneath the waves. Among these forgotten guardians was one man whose story nearly vanished forever. For 4 decades, he chose duty over comfort, silence over company, responsibility over recognition. Long after the world stopped paying attention, he continued climbing those worn stone steps, trimming the great lamp, polishing the giant lenses, and watching over strangers who would never know who had saved them. His life became part of the lighthouse itself. The walls remembered his footsteps. The lantern knew his hands. Even the seabirds seemed to recognize the lonely figure who greeted every sunrise from the highest balcony. Then one day, the government announced that everything would change. Machines had become reliable. Automation was cheaper. Human lighthouse keepers were no longer considered necessary. After 40 years of faithful service, the man who had protected countless lives was simply told it was time to leave. No ceremony, no celebration, no crowd waiting outside, only silence. When workers finally entered the lighthouse after his departure, they expected to find little more than old furniture and worn equipment. Instead, they discovered something that stopped every one of them. Hidden inside a wooden drawer, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the sea air, was a handwritten letter. It wasn't addressed to his family, nor to the government, nor to anyone he had ever worked with. It was written to people he would never meet, to future generations, to anyone willing to remember the lonely lives behind the light that had guided ships through the darkness for centuries. Those pages revealed what 40 years of solitude truly cost, the fears he never confessed, the sacrifices no newspaper ever mentioned, the quiet acts of courage that history almost erased. This is the story of a man whose greatest achievement was making sure everyone else arrived home safely, even if it meant giving up the chance to truly have a home himself. This is the story of one of history's forgotten lighthouse keepers. Long before anyone knew him as a lonely keeper of a lighthouse, he was simply a quiet boy growing up in a small fishing village where the sea shaped every part of daily life. The village itself was little more than a handful of stone cottages gathered around a narrow harbor. Fishing boats left before sunrise, returning only when the tide allowed. Salt hung permanently in the air, mixing with the smell of wet rope, fresh fish, and weathered wood. Every family depended on the ocean in one way or another, and every child learned very early that the sea could provide everything or take everything away. Unlike the other boys, who dreamed of becoming captains or merchants, he found himself fascinated by something else entirely. Every evening, just before darkness settled over the coastline, a distant light would slowly begin turning across the horizon. It flashed, disappeared, returned, again, always there. His grandfather noticed him watching it almost every night. "That's the lighthouse," the old man said one evening as they sat on the harbor wall. "As long as that light keeps turning, someone out there will find their way home." Those words stayed with him far longer than either of them could have imagined. Years passed, but his curiosity never faded. Whenever storms rolled in from the open sea, most villagers hurried indoors, closing shutters and praying the boats already at sea would survive until morning. He did the opposite. He would stand beneath the shelter of the harbor warehouse, staring toward the distant beam cutting through walls of rain and crashing waves. He wondered who kept that light burning. Did the keeper ever get frightened? Did he ever grow tired? Did loneliness eventually become heavier than the storms themselves? No one seemed interested in answering those questions. To everyone else, the lighthouse was simply part of the landscape, useful, reliable, invisible. But for him, it became an obsession. As a teenager, he spent countless afternoons helping old fishermen repair nets, not because he enjoyed the work, but because they carried stories from the sea. Some spoke of impossible waves that rose higher than church towers. Others remembered nights so dark they could no longer see the bow of their own boats. Yet almost every story ended the same way. We found the light. Or, the keeper never let the lamp go out. The more he listened, the more he realized that countless lives depended on someone whose name almost nobody remembered. One winter afternoon, a violent storm swept across the coast with almost no warning. The harbor filled with frightened families waiting for boats that should have returned hours earlier. The wind screamed through the village streets. Windows rattled. Children cried. Even the oldest fishermen admitted they had rarely seen waves so violent. Night fell. Still no boats. Hours later, far out beyond the breakers, someone spotted the lighthouse. Its beam continued sweeping across the black water with perfect rhythm, refusing to disappear despite the hurricane-force winds. Near dawn, one damaged fishing boat finally emerged from the darkness. Then another. Every crew credited the same thing. Without the lighthouse, none of them believed they would have survived. That morning changed him forever. While everyone else celebrated the safe return of their loved ones, he found himself thinking about the unseen man who had remained inside that lonely tower throughout the entire storm. No applause, no newspaper headline, no celebration. Just another night of doing his duty. For the first time, he understood that the greatest acts of courage often happen where almost no one was watching. From that day forward, he no longer dreamed of sailing across the oceans. He dreamed of protecting those who did. His parents struggled to understand. His mother hoped he would become a teacher. His father wanted him to inherit the family's fishing boat. Friends laughed when he admitted he wanted to work in a lighthouse. "You'll spend your whole life talking to seagulls," one joked. Another laughed. "You'll forget what people even look like." He smiled politely but never argued. Some dreams don't need approval. They only need patience. As the years passed, he studied everything he could about navigation, weather, tides, optics, mechanical equipment, and maritime safety. Books became as important to him as the sea itself. He learned how lenses magnified light across incredible distances. He studied the engineering behind rotating beacons. He memorized tide charts. He practiced repairing mechanical clocks and oil lamps with meticulous precision. Older sailors began noticing the quiet young man asking questions no one his age usually cared about. They answered every one, not because they expected him to become famous, but because they recognized genuine respect. Eventually, word reached the regional lighthouse authority that a disciplined young man from the fishing village hoped to become an assistant keeper. Months passed without a reply. Life continued. Then one crisp autumn morning, a letter finally arrived. It was short, formal, almost cold. A position had become available. Remote coastal station. Training would begin immediately. Accommodation provided. Isolation expected. Applicants unwilling to spend extended periods away from civilization need not accept. He read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully. His mother cried quietly over dinner. His father stared silently through the window toward the sea. Neither tried to stop him. Deep down, they already knew. His heart had belonged to that distant light since childhood. Within a week, carrying only a small suitcase, a few books, family photographs, and the determination of a man chasing a lifelong calling, he boarded the supply vessel that would carry him toward the lonely lighthouse where he would spend the next 40 years. He had no way of knowing that the journey beginning that morning would slowly erase him from the memory of almost everyone, while making him unforgettable to the sea itself. The supply boat left the harbor just after sunrise. Standing at the stern, he watched his village slowly disappear behind a curtain of sea mist. The church tower became a shadow. The rows of small cottages blended into the coastline. Soon, even the harbor vanished from sight. For the first time in his life, there was nothing around him except water. The captain barely spoke during the journey. He had delivered supplies to remote lighthouses for nearly 30 years, and had seen many young recruits arrive full of excitement. Most of them never lasted. Some left after a few months, others after a single winter. Very few stayed long enough to truly become lighthouse keepers. Around midday, the captain finally broke the silence. "You still have time to change your mind." The young man smiled politely. "I won't." The old sailor nodded without another word. He had heard that answer before. The difference, he noticed, was in the young man's eyes. There was no fear, only determination. By late afternoon, the lighthouse finally appeared. At first, it looked impossibly small against the endless ocean. As the boat approached, its true scale emerged. A massive stone tower rose directly from a jagged rocky island, surrounded by cliffs constantly battered by waves. There were no trees, no beach, no village, no road, only stone, wind, sea, and the lighthouse. It looked less like a building and more like a monument built to challenge nature itself. Landing was far more dangerous than he expected. The supply boat couldn't dock beside the rocks because the waves crashed too violently. Instead, the captain waited patiently for the swell to lift the vessel before shouting for him to jump onto a narrow landing platform. Timing was everything. Too early, he would fall between the boat and the rocks. Too late, the vessel would pull away, leaving him in the water. His heart raced. The captain shouted, "Now!" He jumped. His boot struck the wet stone. Another keeper grabbed his arm and pulled him safely onto the platform just as a wave exploded against the cliffs below. The supply boat immediately backed away. Within minutes, it was already disappearing toward the mainland. He stood motionless, watching it go. An unexpected feeling settled over him. For the first time, there was no easy way home. The senior lighthouse keeper approached with slow, confident steps. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s whose face had been carved by decades of wind, salt, and sunlight. His handshake was firm. "So you're the new assistant?" "Yes, sir." The older man smiled faintly. "You can stop calling me sir. I haven't answered to that in 20 years. They climbed a long spiral staircase together. The walls were thick stone, cold even during summer. Every few steps, narrow windows revealed the restless ocean outside. The higher they climbed, the stronger the wind howled around the tower. Finally, they reached the lantern room. Sunlight poured through enormous crystal lenses unlike anything he had ever seen. The massive Fresnel lens dominated the room like a work of art. Even while unlit, it seemed almost alive. The older keeper rested one hand gently against its brass frame. "This," he said quietly, "is the reason ships return home." The young assistant stepped closer. The lens reflected dozens of tiny versions of his own face. He had read about these remarkable inventions. He had studied diagrams. He had memorized every technical description. But none of that prepared him for seeing one in person. It was magnificent. For nearly an hour, the senior keeper explained every mechanism. The clockwork system that rotated the light. The weights that had to be wound several times each day. The oil reservoirs. The burners. The ventilation system. The polishing process. Every task mattered. Dust could weaken the beam. A damaged wick could reduce visibility. A delayed rotation might confuse navigators. Perfection wasn't encouraged. It was required. As evening approached, his training truly began. Together they cleaned every pane of glass, polished every brass fitting, checked every gear, inspected every bolt. The work demanded patience rather than strength. Nothing happened quickly inside a lighthouse. Everything followed rhythm. Everything followed discipline. Just before sunset, the older keeper handed him a clean cloth. "One fingerprint," he said, "can scatter enough light to matter." The young man carefully wiped the enormous glass panels until they shone without a single mark. Outside, darkness slowly covered the sea. The horizon disappeared. The ocean became a black void stretching into infinity. Then came the moment he had imagined since childhood. The lamp was lit. A warm golden glow filled the lantern room. The enormous lens captured the light and transformed it into an intense beam that swept across the ocean. He watched silently as the brilliant light disappeared into the darkness before returning seconds later. Again, 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 exactly as he watched from the harbor wall so many years before. Except now, he wasn't looking toward the lighthouse. He was inside it. The senior keeper noticed the expression on his face. I had that same look on my first night. What happened? The old man smiled. I realized the lighthouse wasn't protecting me. He paused before finishing. I was protecting everyone else. The words settled deep within him. Later that night, after supper, he unpacked his few belongings. One suitcase, a family photograph, 3 books, a journal, a fountain pen, and a small pocket compass his grandfather had given him before he left. He placed the compass beside the narrow bed in his tiny room. The room itself contained almost nothing. A wooden bed, a chair, a wash basin, a bookshelf, one small window facing the sea. There was no luxury, no decoration, no unnecessary comfort. Everything inside the lighthouse existed for one purpose: to keep the light alive. As midnight approached, the older keeper woke him. Come with me? They climbed back to the lantern room. Far below, barely visible through the darkness, a cargo ship slowly crossed the horizon. Its navigation lights blinked faintly. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the vessel. Seconds later, the ship answered with a single blast of its horn. The deep sound echoed across the empty ocean before fading into silence. The young assistant instinctively smiled. The older keeper smiled too. They're thanking us. Neither man waved. There was no audience, no applause, no celebration. Only 2 silent guardians standing high above the sea, doing a job that thousands depended upon, and almost nobody ever noticed. The days quickly settled into a rhythm unlike anything he had ever experienced. There were no clocks announcing the hours, no church bells, no bustling streets, no conversations drifting through open windows. Time inside the lighthouse was measured differently, by the tides, by the weather, by sunrise, by sunset, by the turning of the great lens above. Every morning began before dawn. Long before the first hint of daylight appeared on the horizon, both keepers climbed the spiral staircase, carrying cleaning cloths, tools, and notebooks. The lamp had burned faithfully throughout the night, but its work was not yet finished. Every surface had to be inspected. The burners were dismantled and cleaned. The oil reservoirs were checked for contamination. The ventilation channels were cleared of soot. Even the smallest amount of salt carried by the wind could slowly damage the delicate mechanisms. The senior keeper often repeated the same lesson. The sea is patient. It never attacks all at once. It wins by never stopping. Those words proved true. Salt reached places that seemed impossible. Metal rusted. Wood swelled. Glass collected invisible crystals. Nothing inside the lighthouse could ever be neglected. Every bolt demanded attention. Every hinge required oil. Every window had to remain perfectly transparent. The work itself was repetitive, but never meaningless. One cloudy afternoon, while polishing the brass fittings surrounding the great Fresnel lens, the young assistant asked a question that had been on his mind since arriving. Have you ever wanted to leave? The older keeper continued polishing without looking up. Many times. The answer surprised him. I thought you loved this place. I do. The older man smiled faintly. But loving something doesn't mean it never becomes difficult. For several moments, only the sound of cloth against polished brass filled the room. Then he continued. The first year, you miss people. The second year, you miss noise. The third year, you realize you've forgotten what silence felt like before you came here. And after that, the older keeper stopped working. He looked through the lantern glass toward the endless sea. After that, you stopped counting. Those words lingered in the young man's thoughts for the rest of the day. That evening, thick fog rolled across the coastline. Within minutes, the entire ocean disappeared beneath a blanket of gray. The lighthouse itself seemed to float inside an endless cloud. Visibility dropped so dramatically that even the waves crashing against the rocks below could no longer be seen. Only heard. The senior keeper immediately became more alert. This, he said quietly, is when ships become blind. He led the young assistant downstairs to the fog signal room. Unlike the lantern above, this machinery produced sound instead of light. Massive compressed air equipment powered an enormous foghorn capable of carrying for miles across the sea. When activated, the deep blast shook the entire lighthouse. The first note echoed through the fog like the voice of some ancient giant. It rolled across the hidden ocean, disappeared, returned as distant echoes from unseen cliffs. Again, every few minutes, always following precise timing recorded in the lighthouse regulations. The young assistant suddenly understood something he had never considered before. On clear nights, sailors followed the light. On foggy nights, they followed the sound. Hours passed. The fog never lifted. Around midnight, while checking the lantern room, they noticed something unusual. Far below, barely visible through the mist, a faint white light appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. The older keeper grabbed the telescope. His expression immediately changed. Fishing vessel. Too close. The young assistant felt his heartbeat quicken. The ship wasn't following its intended course. It was drifting dangerously toward the rocky coastline surrounding the lighthouse. The captain likely couldn't see the cliffs. Perhaps he couldn't even see the lighthouse itself. Only the distant glow breaking through the fog. The senior keeper wasted no time. He adjusted the fog signal sequence, activated the emergency warning pattern, then instructed his assistant to increase the lamp's intensity by replacing one of the burners. Together, they worked with practiced precision despite the urgency. Every movement had purpose. Every second mattered. The foghorn roared once more. Longer this time. More powerful. Moments later, the faint light below slowly changed direction. Very gradually, the vessel turned away from the rocks. Neither keeper spoke. They simply watched. Minute by minute, the ship disappeared safely back into fog. Only then did the older man finally release a quiet breath. Another crew will go home tonight, without ever knowing how close they came. The young assistant looked across the empty sea. There would be no newspaper article, no official report, no medal, no captain arriving the next morning to offer thanks. The fishermen aboard that vessel might never even realize they had been in danger. The lighthouse had done exactly what it was built to do: protect lives without asking for recognition. As dawn finally arrived, the fog began to dissolve. Sunlight slowly revealed the coastline once again. Everything looked peaceful, almost ordinary. Only the exhausted faces of the two keepers revealed what the night had demanded. While preparing breakfast, the senior keeper poured 2 cups of tea before quietly saying something the young assistant would remember for the rest of his life. The best night for a lighthouse keeper is the one nobody ever hears about. Only years later would he truly understand the weight of those words. Winter arrived with force that no book could ever have prepared him for. Back in the village where he had grown up, storms came and went. People closed their shutters. Families gathered around fireplaces. By morning, life usually returned to normal. Out here, winter was something entirely different. The sea no longer looked alive. It looked angry. 4 days at a time, waves exploded against the rocks with such violence that the entire lighthouse trembled. The stone tower had stood for generations, yet every impact felt powerful enough to shake its foundations. The sound never stopped. Day, night, hour after hour. The ocean hammered relentlessly against the island as though trying to reclaim it. On one particularly violent evening, the wind became so strong that speaking inside the lantern room required shouting. Rain struck the glass like handfuls of gravel. Outside, visibility had disappeared completely. The beam of light vanished into a wall of water only a few yards from the tower. Even so, the light had to continue turning. Ships were still out there, somewhere beyond the darkness. The senior keeper calmly checked every mechanism one last time before looking toward the young assistant. Tonight, we don't sleep much. The words proved true almost immediately. Shortly after midnight, a deep metallic sound echoed through the lighthouse. Not the familiar creaking of old wood, not the whistle of the wind. Something different. Both men froze. Another loud bang followed. Then another. The older keeper grabbed a lantern, the outside platform. Without hesitation, They descended several flights of stairs before opening a heavy iron door leading onto the exterior walkway. The wind nearly tore the door from their hands. The cold struck like a solid wall. Rain soaked them within seconds. Holding tightly to the safety rail, they slowly made their way around the tower. Each step demanded complete concentration. One mistake, one loose grip, and the sea waiting below would offer no second chance. The beam from the lantern barely pierced the rain. Finally, they found the source of the noise. One of the heavy steel brackets supporting part of the storm shutter system had broken loose. Every powerful gust slammed against a stone wall. If left unattended, it could eventually shatter one of the lantern windows above. That couldn't be allowed. Without those windows, the light itself could fail. The senior keeper handed him a wrench. We fix it now. There was no alternative. Working together, they fought against freezing rain and relentless wind. More than once, waves crashed high enough to drench the entire platform. Salt water stung their eyes. Their hands quickly became numb. Simple tasks suddenly required enormous effort. Several times, the young assistant wondered whether they should abandon the repair until daylight. The older man seemed to read his thoughts. The storm won't wait. Neither can we. Nearly an hour later, the damaged bracket was finally secured with temporary bolts. It would hold until permanent repairs could be made. Exhausted, they returned inside. Water pooled beneath their boots. Their clothes were soaked through. Neither complained. Instead, they climbed directly back to the lantern room. The light was still turning, exactly as it should. The older keeper looked at the great lens with quiet satisfaction. Good. Then he disappeared downstairs to prepare hot tea. Only after he left did the young assistant realize something remarkable. Not once during the repair had the older man shown fear, only focus. The next morning brought little relief. The storm continued. Supply boats, already scheduled to arrive that week, were forced to remain in port. No one could reach the lighthouse safely. Food wasn't yet a concern. The storerooms had been designed for long periods of isolation, but fresh vegetables, newspapers, and letters would have to wait. The young assistant found himself thinking about home, his parents, the familiar streets, the small harbor. He wondered whether they were looking toward the lighthouse at that very moment. Could they see its beam through the storm? Were they thinking about him? The senior keeper interrupted his thoughts. Missing home? The young man nodded. The older keeper smiled knowingly. It never completely goes away. He opened a small wooden cabinet and removed an old leather-bound notebook. Its pages were filled with neat handwriting stretching back decades. Storm reports, weather observations, maintenance notes, but scattered between them were brief personal reflections. The senior keeper turned to the very first page. I started writing this during my first winter. The young assistant carefully read a single sentence. I thought loneliness would be the hardest part. I was wrong. It is wondering whether the people you love still think about you. He looked up. When did you write this? 36 years ago. And now? The older keeper smiled gently. Now I know something important. What? The people who truly love you don't stop thinking about you, even when the seas stand between you. That evening, after completing his duties, the young assistant opened his own journal for the first time since arriving. He dipped his fountain pen into the ink bottle. For several minutes, he couldn't think of what to write. Finally, only one sentence appeared on the page. The sea is louder than I imagined, but the silence inside me is beginning to grow louder too. He closed the journal. Outside, another wave struck the rocks. High above the storm, the lighthouse continued sending its faithful beam into the darkness, exactly as it had done the night before, and exactly as it would do tomorrow. By the second year, he no longer counted the days. Instead, he counted the seasons. He knew exactly when the seabirds would return to nest on the cliffs. He recognized the first autumn storms long before dark clouds appeared on the horizon. He could predict the tides simply by listening to the rhythm of the waves striking the rocks below. The lighthouse was slowly changing him, not by making him stronger, but by teaching him to observe. Every sound meant something. Every change in the wind carried a message. Every unusual movement on the sea deserved attention. It was a different way of living, a slower one. One afternoon, while inspecting the western gallery surrounding the lantern room, he noticed a flock of gulls circling wildly over a section of open water several miles offshore. At first, it seemed ordinary. Then he frowned. The birds weren't diving for fish. They were circling. Again, again, again. The senior keeper stepped beside him. "What is it?" "I'm not sure." The older man raised his telescope. His expression immediately became serious. "Life raft." The words were almost whispered. The young assistant took the telescope. Far away, barely visible between the swells, floated a tiny object rising and falling with the waves. Without magnification, it looked like nothing more than driftwood. Through the lens, it was unmistakable. An emergency raft. There were people inside. At least 2, maybe 3. The senior keeper wasted no time. The lighthouse maintained emergency communication equipment for exactly these situations. Although primitive compared to modern systems, it was capable of contacting the nearest coastal station. Within minutes, distress information had been transmitted. Coordinates, weather conditions, estimated drift, everything they could observe. Then, there was nothing more they could do. The young assistant remained at the window, watching, waiting. Hours passed. The raft continued drifting with the current, sometimes disappearing completely behind towering waves, sometimes reappearing just long enough to remind them that human lives were still hanging in the balance. Near sunset, a rescue vessel finally appeared. Small, determined, battling rough seas toward the drifting raft. Both lighthouse keepers watched in complete silence. Eventually, the rescue ship reached the survivors. One by one, they were pulled aboard. Only when the vessel turned safely toward the mainland did either man speak. The young assistant smiled. "We helped save them." The older keeper nodded. "We did." Then he added quietly, "And they'll probably never know." The words no longer sounded sad, only true. That night, while winding the heavy clockwork mechanism that rotated the great lens, the young assistant found himself thinking about all the invisible moments hidden inside history. People remembered famous captains, admirals, explorers, inventors. But how many remembered the anonymous hands that kept the lights burning? How many families had gone to sleep peacefully because someone they would never meet had quietly done his duty? He suspected the answer was very few. Several weeks later, the supply boat returned. Its arrival transformed the lighthouse. Fresh food, mail, replacement parts, newspapers. For a few precious hours, voices echoed to the stone tower once again. The captain greeted both keepers warmly before unloading crates one by one. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, medical supplies, fresh fruit, bundles of letters tied carefully with twine. The senior keeper handed him 3 envelopes. "These are yours." His heart quickened. The first letter came from his mother. She wrote about ordinary things: the vegetable garden, neighbors, the church roof being repaired, a wedding in the village. Nothing extraordinary, yet every sentence felt precious. The second letter came from his father. As expected, it was much shorter, only 1 page. Near the end, one sentence stood out: "I look toward your light every clear night." He read it 3 times before carefully folding the page again. The third envelope surprised him. It came from his younger sister. She had enclosed a simple pencil drawing made by her little son. It showed a tall lighthouse beside the sea. A tiny figure stood at the top. Above the drawing, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, "That's Uncle." He smiled despite himself. For the first time in weeks, the lighthouse no longer felt completely isolated. Home had somehow crossed the ocean inside 3 envelopes. That evening, after supper, the senior keeper quietly lit the small fireplace in the common room. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, the older keeper asked, "Did they write good news?" "They wrote normal news." The old man smiled. "Sometimes. That's even better." The young assistant understood exactly what he meant. Normal life had become something rare, almost luxurious. The next morning, before the supply boat departed, the captain approached him privately. "I've got room for one passenger if you've changed your mind." The young assistant looked toward the sea, then toward the lighthouse towering above them. Finally, he smiled. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The captain nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." As the boat disappeared beyond the horizon, silence returned once again, but this time it felt different. The loneliness was still there. The endless ocean was still there. The wind still howled through the stone walls. Yet something inside him had quietly changed. He no longer felt like a visitor assigned to a remote lighthouse. For the first time, he felt like its keeper. The third year brought something no storm had ever managed to accomplish. Routine. Not the kind that dulls the mind. The kind that quietly becomes part of who you are. He no longer needed written schedules. His body woke before dawn without an alarm. His hands instinctively reached for the maintenance log before breakfast. He could hear when one of the lantern's gears needed lubrication long before any visible sign appeared. The lighthouse had become an extension of himself. Every staircase, every bolt, every narrow corridor, every window overlooking the sea. Nothing felt unfamiliar anymore. Even the endless sound of the waves, which had once kept him awake at night, had become almost comforting. Visitors often imagined that lighthouse life was peaceful. They pictured quiet evenings reading books while watching sunsets over the ocean. Reality was different. There was almost never a day without work. When the lantern wasn't demanding attention, the building itself was. Stone walls required constant inspection. Iron railings rusted faster than anyone on land could imagine. The roof had to withstand relentless winds. Rainwater found the smallest cracks. Wood expanded, metal contracted, salt invaded everything. The sea never stopped testing the lighthouse, and the lighthouse keepers never stopped answering. One unusually calm morning, while inspecting the eastern side of the tower, he noticed something unexpected. A seal had climbed onto one of the lower rocks exposed by the tide. It lay perfectly still beneath the morning sun. Curious, he watched from above. Soon another appeared, then another. Within an hour, nearly a dozen seals rested together on the rocks. The senior keeper smiled. "They've been coming here longer than we have." For several days, the animals returned with every low tide. They seemed completely unbothered by the presence of the lighthouse. Occasionally, one would lift its head toward the tower before returning to sleep. The young keeper found himself looking forward to those quiet moments. Without realizing it, he had begun recognizing individual animals. One carried an old scar across its back. Another always rested on the same rock. One curious young seal seemed fascinated by the movement of the lantern room high above. The older keeper noticed his growing interest. "Careful," he laughed. "They have a way of becoming your neighbors." Perhaps he was right. Life in isolation changed the meaning of companionship. Months later, the seals disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived. He missed them more than he expected. It was a strange realization. Back on the mainland, he had barely noticed wildlife. Here, every living creature mattered. Every passing bird, every dolphin following distant fishing boats, every whale visible during migration. The sea no longer felt empty. It was simply inhabited differently. As the years continued, he developed another unexpected habit. Every evening, after lighting the great lamp, he spent exactly 10 minutes standing alone on the outer gallery, not working, not inspecting equipment, simply watching. The horizon was never the same twice. Some evenings burned orange beneath enormous clouds. Others dissolved into soft shades of blue and silver. During winter, sunsets disappeared behind walls of rain. During summer, the ocean became so calm that it reflected the sky almost perfectly. He began writing brief descriptions in his journal, not technical observations, personal ones. Today the sea looked like polished glass. The gulls flew lower than usual before the rain. Sunrise painted the clouds gold for only 30 seconds. Little by little, the journal changed. It was no longer only a record of maintenance. It became a record of life itself. One afternoon, while reorganizing an old storage room beneath the tower, he discovered several dusty wooden boxes tucked behind forgotten shelves. Inside were logbooks kept by lighthouse keepers who had lived there a decade before. Some pages dated back more than 70 years. The handwriting varied. Some entries were meticulous, others hurried. Most recorded weather conditions, wind direction, repairs, supply deliveries. But hidden between those official notes were deeply human moments. Storm lasted 43 hours. Missed my daughter's birthday. Heard a whale singing all night. Today I dreamed I was walking through a crowded street and woke missing voices. Another simply read. The light never failed. Nothing more. He carefully closed the book. For several minutes, he said nothing. The senior keeper eventually joined him. I wonder when you find those. Why keep them? The older man gently brushed dust from one of the covers. Because someday, someone will read ours too. The thought stayed with him long after they returned upstairs. For the first time, he realized he wasn't merely maintaining a lighthouse. He had become part of a chain stretching back generations. Men he would never meet had climbed these same stairs, held these same lanterns, watched these same storms, protected the same coastline. Now it was his turn. One evening, while writing in his own journal, he paused before adding a final sentence beneath the day's weather report. I hope whoever reads this someday understands that the hardest part was never the storms. He stared at the unfinished line for a long moment, then continued writing. It was learning that doing something important does not always mean anyone will remember your name. He closed the journal gently. Outside, the great beam continued its endless rotation across the dark ocean. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another ship would see that familiar light. Its crew would adjust their course. They would reach home safely. They would embrace their families, celebrate birthdays, watch their children grow, and almost certainly they would never wonder who had kept the light alive that night. He no longer minded. Recognition had quietly stopped being part of the job. Duty had become enough. 10 years passed almost without him noticing. The young assistant who had once arrived carrying a single suitcase was now the senior keeper of the lighthouse. The man who had trained him had finally retired. There had been no grand farewell, no officials, no speeches, only one supply boat waiting beside the rocks. Before leaving, the older man climbed the lantern room one last time. He slowly rested his hand on the brass frame of the great Fresnel lens, exactly as he had done on the young man's first day. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, the old keeper smiled. I've been trying to think of some final advice. The younger man waited. The old man laughed softly. I don't think you need any. He looked around the lantern room one last time. You already understand. Then, before descending the spiral staircase for the last time, he added one sentence that will remain with him forever. The lighthouse never belonged to us. We only borrowed it. Those words echoed in his mind as he watched the supply boat disappear into the distance. For the first time since arriving all those years ago, he was completely alone, not for a few days, not for a week, truly alone. That first evening felt strangely different. Every familiar sound seemed louder. Every footstep echoed longer inside the stone tower. Even preparing dinner for one person instead of two reminded him that an entire chapter of his life had quietly ended. Yet the work remained exactly the same. The lamp still needed cleaning. The clockwork still required winding. The weather still demanded observation. Ships still crossed the coastline every night. The lighthouse never paused simply because someone left. Several months later, a letter arrived informing him that no replacement would be assigned immediately. Budget reductions, personnel shortages, temporary arrangement. He would remain the only keeper until further notice. Weeks became months. Months became years. The temporary arrangement quietly became permanent. He adapted. He had no other choice. His daily routine grew even more disciplined. Every task followed precise timing. At sunrise, he inspected exterior walls. Mid-morning was reserved for maintenance. Afternoons were dedicated to repairs, inventory, and weather reports. Before sunset, every part of the lantern received its final inspection. At dusk, the light came alive. After midnight, another inspection. Before dawn, the cycle began again. Without another person nearby, mistakes became unacceptable. There was no one to notice if he forgot something. No second pair of eyes. No one to take over if he became exhausted. The responsibility rested entirely on him. One winter morning, while carrying tools down the narrow iron staircase, he slipped on a wet step. His foot missed the edge. He fell hard against a stone wall before tumbling several more steps. Pain shot through his shoulder. For several minutes he remained where he had fallen, breathing slowly until the dizziness passed. Nothing appeared broken, only bruised. As he carefully stood, a thought struck him with unexpected force. If the injury had been worse, no one would have known. The next supply boat wasn't scheduled for another 11 days. There were no telephones inside the lighthouse, no nearby neighbors, no passing traffic, just the sea. That realization changed the way he worked. From then on, every task became more deliberate. He never climbed ladders unnecessarily. He tied safety ropes whenever conditions worsened. He carried medical supplies with him during difficult repairs, not because he feared death, because he understood responsibility. If something happened to him, the light might fail. Years continued passing. His hair slowly turned gray. The lines around his eyes deepened. The journals filled shelf after shelf. Sometimes, while dusting old logbooks, he would pause to read entries written years earlier. He smiled at things he had completely forgotten. The seals returned today. The first snow arrived unusually early, repaired the eastern railing after another storm. Simple moments, ordinary days, yet together they formed the story of an entire life. Occasionally, curious tourists passed aboard sightseeing boats during calm summer afternoons. They pointed cameras toward the lighthouse. Children waved enthusiastically. He often waved back from a gallery. The boats rarely slowed down. Within minutes, they disappeared beyond the horizon. He wondered how many passengers believed the lighthouse was empty. Many modern people assume the great towers operated entirely on their own. They never imagined someone still climbed those endless stairs every single day. He didn't mind. The lighthouse had never existed to be admired. It existed to serve. One autumn evening, while polishing the lantern glass, he noticed a small passenger ship crossing unusually close to the coastline. Families stood along the upper deck, enjoying the sunset. Children laughed. A little girl pointed excitedly toward the lighthouse. He instinctively smiled and raised one hand. To his surprise, several passengers noticed. One by one, people began waving back. The little girl jumped excitedly, both arms raised high above her head. For only a few seconds, the lonely keeper and dozens of complete strangers shared a silent greeting across the water. Then the ship continued toward the open sea. The laughter faded. The voices disappeared. Silence returned. Yet that brief exchange stayed with him for days. Not because he needed recognition, but because, for a fleeting moment, someone had remembered there was a human being inside the lighthouse. That night, before extinguishing the lantern at sunrise, he stood beside the great lens and looked across the endless ocean. The sea was calm. The first light of dawn painted the horizon with pale gold. He quietly whispered words no one else would ever hear. As long as I can climb these stairs, the light will never go out. It was not a promise made to the government, nor to history, nor even to himself. It was a promise made to every unknown sailor still searching for home beyond the horizon. 15 years had passed since he first climbed the lighthouse steps as a nervous young assistant. The sea had become his calendar. The wind had become his companion. The lighthouse had become his home. By then, almost every sailor navigating that stretch of coastline trusted the great beams sweeping across the horizon. Few knew the keeper. All depended on him. One cold evening in early November, the weather changed with unusual speed. The morning had been calm. The afternoon brought a sharp drop in temperature. By sunset, dark clouds covered the western sky. He had seen storms before, hundreds of them, but something about this one felt different. The air was strangely heavy. The seabirds disappeared hours earlier than usual. Even the seals that often rested on the lower rocks had vanished. Nature was warning anyone willing to pay attention. He completed his inspections more quickly than normal. Every window was secured, every mechanism checked twice. Extra lamp oil was prepared. Emergency tools were placed beside the lantern room. Then he waited. The first gust arrived shortly after nightfall. Within minutes, the lighthouse shook beneath the force of the wind. Rain slammed against the glass in violent sheets. The beam continued turning faithfully, cutting brief paths through the darkness before disappearing into the storm. Hours passed. The storm intensified. Then something caught his attention, far beyond the normal shipping lane. A faint white flare shot into the sky. It burned brightly for only a few seconds before vanishing. His heart immediately quickened. A distress flare. He grabbed the telescope. Nothing, only darkness. Several minutes later, another flare, this one closer. There was no doubt. A ship was in trouble. He rushed downstairs to activate the emergency radio. Static filled the room. He repeated the coordinates, weather conditions, estimated location. Again. Finally, a distant coastal station answered. The signal was weak but understandable. A rescue vessel had already departed. Estimated arrival, nearly 3 hours. He looked back toward the storm outside. 3 hours might be too late. Returning to the lantern room, he searched desperately through the rain. The third flare finally revealed the outline of the vessel. It was smaller than he expected. Probably a coastal cargo ship. It was drifting, not under control. Each massive wave pushed it closer toward the reef surrounding the lighthouse. He immediately understood the danger. If the captain continued following the current, the ship would strike submerged rocks before rescue arrived. There was no way to contact the vessel directly. No modern radar. No satellite communication. Only the lighthouse and the man inside it. He remembered something the old senior keeper had once taught him. Emergency light signals. Rarely used. Almost forgotten, but still recognized by experienced captains. Without hesitation, he disengaged the normal rotation mechanism. For the first time in years, the lighthouse stopped its steady rhythm. Instead, he manually directed the powerful beam toward the struggling ship. Long flash. Pause. Long flash. Pause. 3 short flashes. Another pause. Again. The pattern repeated exactly as described in the old emergency manuals. His arms quickly grew tired. The great mechanism had never been designed for constant manual operation. Still, he continued. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Rain blinded him. Wind shook the lantern room. His shoulders ached from controlling the enormous lens assembly. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Then the ship changed course. Only slightly. Then again, slowly, painfully, its bow began turning away from the reef. He almost couldn't believe it. The captain had understood. Another enormous wave crashed across the vessel. For several terrifying seconds, the ship disappeared completely behind a wall of water. When it emerged again, it was pointing toward deeper water. He kept signaling, minute after minute, never stopping. Finally, far in the distance, another light appeared. The rescue vessel. Its searchlight swept across the storm until eventually finding the damaged cargo ship. Only then did he allow himself to release the control mechanism. The lighthouse returned to its familiar rhythm. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. Exactly as it always had. His arms trembled from exhaustion. His hands were raw. His shoulders burned. But the danger had passed. Near dawn, the coastal station finally contacted him again. The message was brief. The crew survived. Nothing more. No details. No names. No ceremony. He quietly wrote the outcome into the official logbook. Distress vessel observed. Emergency signaling initiated. Rescue confirmed. Only 3 short lines. The official record gave no hint of the long hours spent standing against the storm. It mentioned nothing about fear, nothing about uncertainty, nothing about the desperate hope that someone beyond the darkness would understand the light. That afternoon, after finally sleeping for a few hours, he stepped onto the outer gallery. The storm had passed. The sea looked almost peaceful again, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Days later, the supply captain arrived with fresh provisions. Before unloading the crates, he smiled broadly. I heard about the cargo ship. The keeper looked surprised. They told you. Sailors talk. The captain chuckled. They say the lighthouse itself saved them. The keeper smiled politely. It wasn't a lighthouse. The captain looked at him for a long moment, then quietly replied, "No, it wasn't." Neither man said another word. Neither needed to. Sometimes the greatest compliments were the ones spoken only once. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, he climbed the familiar spiral staircase once again. He lit the great lamp, watched the brilliant beam begin its endless journey across the sea. Somewhere out there, a crew of strangers was alive because they had recognized a language older than radio, older than engines, older than almost every modern invention, the language of a lighthouse, and the quiet man who refused to let its light fail. 20 years had passed. Half of his life now belonged to the lighthouse. When he looked into the small mirror hanging beside his wash basin each morning, he barely recognized the young man who had first arrived carrying a single suitcase. His hair had begun turning silver around the temples. His hands had grown rough from decades of salt, brass, stone, and rope. The lines across his face no longer came from worry. They came from wind, from sunlight reflected off endless water, from thousands of nights spent watching the horizon. The lighthouse had marked him as surely as time itself. By then, change had begun arriving from the mainland. At first, it came in the newspapers. Articles about new navigation systems, electronic beacons, improved marine radios, automatic warning devices. He read every article carefully. Technology fascinated him. He never feared progress. But one sentence appeared more frequently with each passing year: fully automated lighthouses. He folded the newspaper slowly. The words lingered in his mind longer than he expected. Several months later, engineers arrived aboard the supply vessel. Unlike the usual sailors, these visitors carried measuring equipment instead of food. They spent 2 days inspecting every corner of the lighthouse: electrical wiring, mechanical systems, foundations, the lantern room, even the ancient Fresnel lens. One young engineer, barely older than the keeper had been when he first arrived, smiled politely. "This place has been remarkably well maintained." The keeper simply nodded. There was nothing to say. The engineer continued, "Most stations aren't in this condition." Again, only silence. Eventually, curiosity overcame him. "Why are you inspecting everything?" The engineer hesitated, then answered honestly, "The government is studying modernization." The keeper looked toward the great lens. "What kind of modernization?" "Automation." The word echoed through the lantern room. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, the engineer added quietly, "It won't happen immediately, but someday." He never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. The keeper understood perfectly. After the visitors departed, the lighthouse felt different. Nothing had physically changed. Yet somehow, everything had. That evening, while polishing the enormous glass panels surrounding the lantern, he caught himself wondering something he had never considered before. What happens to a lighthouse keeper when the lighthouse no longer needs a keeper? The question had no easy answer. Weeks later, another letter arrived from his sister. She wrote that her children had grown. Her oldest son was preparing for university. The little boy who had once drawn a picture of his uncle inside the lighthouse was now a young man. Enclosed with the letter was a recent photograph. He studied it for several minutes. His nephew stood smiling beside a bicycle, tall, confident, almost a stranger. The keeper suddenly realized something painful. He had watched storms reshape entire coastlines. He had seen generations of seabirds come and go. Yet he had completely missed watching his own family grow older. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas dinners, funerals, weddings. Life had continued. Without him, that realization weighed heavily on him for days. One evening, after lighting the lamp, he opened his journal instead of the maintenance log. He stared at the blank page for nearly 10 minutes before writing. "I have spent 20 years making sure strangers found their way home." Then he paused. Slowly, he continued, "But I sometimes wonder how much of my own home disappeared while I wasn't looking. He closed the journal almost immediately. It was one of the shortest entries he had ever written, and perhaps the most honest. As autumn arrived, fewer ships passed the coastline. The nights became longer, the silence deeper. One particularly clear evening, he carried a chair onto the outer gallery after completing his duties. Above him stretched a sky unlike anything people living in cities could ever imagine. Thousands upon thousands of stars filled the darkness. Without electric lights nearby, the heavens seemed impossibly bright. He identified constellations he had learned decades earlier: the North Star, Orion, Cassiopeia, O companions. For hours he simply sat there, listening to the waves, watching the stars, thinking about time. He suddenly understood something curious. The lighthouse wasn't only guiding ships. It had quietly become an anchor for his own life. Every day followed purpose. Every task carried meaning. Every sunrise offered responsibility. Would he still be the same man without these stone walls? Without the lantern? Without the endless sea? He wasn't sure. The following morning, while inspecting the eastern cliff, he noticed fresh footprints. Human footprints. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. No supply boat had arrived. No fisherman had landed. Following the tracks carefully, he eventually found their owner. A young photographer carrying an old camera stood quietly near the edge of the rocks, capturing the lighthouse from below. Startled, the young man quickly apologized. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." The keeper smiled. "You didn't." The photographer hesitated before asking, "Do you really live here alone?" "I do." "For how long?" The keeper looked toward the tower. "About 20 years." The young man lowered his camera. His expression shifted from curiosity to genuine disbelief. "I don't think I could do that." The keeper smiled gently. "I couldn't either, until I did." The photographer laughed softly. Before leaving, he asked one final question. "Don't you ever feel forgotten?" The keeper looked toward the sea for a long moment. Finally, he answered, "I used to." He paused. "But then I realized something. If even one ship reaches home safely because the light was here, then my life was never invisible." The young photographer said nothing. He simply lifted his camera one last time. The shutter clicked. Neither of them knew it then, but that simple photograph would one day become one of the very few images through which the world will remember the lonely man who had quietly kept the light alive for decades. 25 years had passed since he first stepped onto the wet stone landing beneath the lighthouse. The tower no longer felt like the place where he worked. It had become the place where he had lived most of his adult life. Every wall carried a memory. Every staircase held echoes of footsteps stretching back decades. Even the brass railing near the lantern room had been polished smooth by thousands upon thousands of climbs. Sometimes he would place his hand upon it and imagine the keepers before him doing exactly the same thing. The lighthouse was old, but it was never empty. It carried every life that had served within its walls. One rainy afternoon, the supply captain arrived carrying an unusually large crate. Instead of food or maintenance equipment, it contained electrical instruments unlike anything the keeper had seen before. The captain looked uncomfortable. "They're sending more engineers next month." The keeper quietly nodded. "I thought they might." Neither man mentioned automation. The word no longer needed to be spoken. It lingered in every conversation anyway. Over the following weeks, technicians installed new electrical wiring throughout portions of the tower. Backup batteries, modern switches, improved communication equipment. None of it interfered with his daily routine. At least, not yet. One of the younger technicians often asked questions while they worked. "Weren't you ever bored?" The keeper smiled. "No." The young man looked surprised. "Never. There was always something to notice." The technician laughed politely, assuming it was simply the answer of an old man attached to old habits. But the keeper meant every word. The sea was never the same twice. Neither was the sky. Neither was the wind. Only people believed repetition meant sameness. Nature never repeated itself. Late one evening, after the workers had returned to the mainland, he climbed to the lantern room as he always did. He looked around quietly. For the first time, small electric cables ran alongside stone walls that had remained unchanged for generations. The lighthouse was entering a new era. He wondered whether he belonged in it. Days later, another letter arrived from his nephew. This time, the young man wrote personally. He explained that he had become fascinated by engineering. He wanted to design ships. At the end of the letter, one sentence caught the keeper completely by surprise. "You inspire me more than you probably realize." He read those words again and again. For years he believed his life had unfolded far away from everyone else. Yet, somehow, across all those miles, his quiet example had still reached someone. He carefully folded the letter and placed it inside the journal where he kept the drawing his nephew had made as a child. The two papers rested side by side, one drawn by a little boy, the other written by a grown man. 20 years separated them. The lighthouse had silently witnessed every one of those years. That autumn brought one of the most beautiful evenings he had ever seen. The storm clouds disappeared shortly before sunset. The sea became perfectly still. The western sky exploded into shades of orange, crimson, and deep violet. The great Fresnel lens caught the last sunlight before darkness arrived. For several seconds, the crystal seemed almost aglow from within. He stood alone watching the horizon, not thinking, simply grateful. Moments like that had become more valuable than words. No photograph could capture them. No painting could truly preserve them. They belonged only to those fortunate enough to witness them. As darkness settled, he lit the great lamp. Its familiar beams swept across the calm water. Far below, a pod of dolphins surfaced briefly, their backs reflecting the moving light before disappearing once again into the sea. He smiled. Even after 25 years, the ocean still surprised him. Weeks later, a government official finally arrived. Unlike the engineers, this visitor wore a neatly pressed coat rather than work clothes. He carried folders instead of tools. After politely accepting a cup of tea, he opened one of the folders on the wooden table. "There will be changes." The keeper remained silent. The official continued. "The ministry has approved a long-term modernization program." He slid several documents across the table. "The lighthouse will eventually become fully automated." There it was. The sentence he had known was coming for years. Yet hearing it spoken aloud felt strangely different. When he quietly asked, the official looked down at his papers. "Not immediately. There are still evaluations, funding, construction schedules. It could be several more years." Several years. The words offered comfort and sadness at the same time. The official smiled kindly. "You've given extraordinary service." The keeper nodded politely. "I've simply done my job." The official looked around the quiet room. I don't think many people understand what that job truly involved. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the keeper answered with complete sincerity. "They don't have to, if the ships arrived safely." That was enough. The official closed his folder slowly. Before leaving, he paused beside the front door. "I hope history remembers people like you." The keeper smiled gently. History has enough important people already. After the visitor departed, silence settled over the lighthouse once more. He climbed the spiral staircase at his usual pace, opened the lantern room, checked every mechanism, cleaned every surface, lit the lamp, exactly as he had done thousands of times before. The sea did not care about government plans. The waves continued striking the rocks. The wind continued singing through the railings. Ships continued searching for the light. Duty remained unchanged. That night, before writing the day's final entry, he added a sentence unlike any he had written before. "One day this lighthouse may no longer need my hands." He paused, looking toward the steady beam crossing the darkness, then finished the thought. "I only hope it never stops needing someone's heart." 30 years had now passed since he first arrived at the lighthouse. The young man who once dreamed of becoming a keeper had quietly become one of the last of his kind. Across the country, lighthouse after lighthouse was being automated. Some towers no longer housed people. Others stood abandoned, their windows dark, waiting only for new equipment to replace generations of human hands. Each newspaper that arrived seemed to carry another story. Historic lighthouse converted. Last keeper retires. Remote station now fully automated. He never felt anger while reading those headlines. Only a quiet sadness. Not because technology was advancing. He believed it should. Fewer shipwrecks. Better communication. More reliable navigation. Those were victories worth celebrating. What saddened him was something else. The stories were always about machines. Never about the men who had spent their lives before them. It was as though an entire profession was disappearing without anyone stopping to say goodbye. One cold morning, while organizing old records inside the storage room, he discovered a forgotten wooden cabinet hidden behind shelves of spare equipment. The lock had rusted almost beyond recognition. After several careful attempts, it finally opened. Inside were dozens of personal belongings left behind by former keepers. A pipe wrapped in faded cloth, an old pocket watch that no longer worked, a pair of cracked spectacles, a child's knitted scarf, several family photographs whose faces had long since lost their names. Each object belonged to someone who had once climbed these same stairs every day, someone who had watched these same waves, someone who had believed, just as he did, that the light mattered more than recognition. He carefully laid the objects across the wooden table. For nearly an hour, he simply looked at them. No museum had collected these memories. No historian had written about them. Without realizing it, the lighthouse itself had become their final guardian. That evening, instead of writing in the maintenance log first, he opened his journal. His pen hesitated above the paper. Finally he wrote, "Every lighthouse keeps more than ships safe." He paused, then continued, "It keeps the memory of those who refuse to let strangers disappear into darkness." Several days later, the supply captain arrived carrying unexpected news. "They're sending a documentary crew next month." The keeper looked surprised. "A documentary?" The captain nodded. "They're filming historic lighthouses before the modernization program begins." The keeper smiled politely. "I suppose they'll want pictures of the building." The captain laughed. They asked whether the keeper would agree to be interviewed. The keeper immediately shook his head. "I don't think there's anything interesting about me." The captain looked at him with amusement. "That's exactly why they want to talk to you." The following month, a small film crew arrived aboard the supply boat. There were only 4 of them: a cameraman, a sound technician, a producer, and a young reporter who appeared no older than 30. Unlike tourists, they stayed for 2 full days. They filmed every corner of the lighthouse, the winding staircase, the lantern room, the massive Fresnel lens, the cliffs below, the waves crashing against the rocks. Finally, the reporter asked if he would answer a few questions. Reluctantly, he agreed. The interview began simply. "How long have you lived here?" 30 years. "What has been the hardest part?" He thought carefully before answering. "Watching time pass somewhere else." The reporter remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I've watched children become adults through photographs. I've attended weddings through letters. I've mourned friends months after they were buried." The young reporter lowered his notebook. For the first time, his questions no longer sounded prepared. Was it worth it? The keeper looked toward the sea. A cargo ship had just appeared on the horizon. Its silhouette slowly crossed the beam of the lighthouse. He watched it for several moments before replying. "If someone on that ship reaches home tonight because the light was here, then yes, it was worth every day." The cameraman quietly lowered his camera. No one spoke for several seconds. The answer had needed nothing more. Before leaving, the reporter asked one final question. "Do you ever wish people remember your name?" The keeper smiled. "No. I only hope they remember why places like this existed." When the crew finally departed, silence returned once again. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, a package arrived from the mainland. Inside was a copy of the finished documentary. The lighthouse appeared throughout the film. The sea looked magnificent. The storm seemed almost unreal. His own interview lasted less than 3 minutes. He watched it only once, then carefully placed the film beside the old journals. He never watched it again. Years later, that documentary will become one of the last moving images ever recorded of a traditional lighthouse keeper at work. At the time, he never imagined anyone would care. That winter brought unusually heavy snow. The lighthouse looked transformed. Its gray stone walls disappeared beneath white frost. Icicles hung from iron railings. The sea itself seemed quieter. Even the waves sounded different beneath the freezing air. One evening, while clearing ice from the outer gallery, he suddenly stopped. Far across the water, he noticed dozens of lights. Not ships, the coastline. A new highway had opened. Small towns had grown into cities. Factories now illuminated the horizon throughout the night. The darkness he had known for decades was slowly disappearing. For the first time, he wondered whether future generations would ever understand what true night had once looked like. He quietly rested both hands upon the cold iron railing, looking toward the distant glow of civilization, then back toward the lonely beam still sweeping faithfully across the sea. The world had changed almost beyond recognition. Yet here, inside the old lighthouse, the light still turned, just as it always had, just as he had promised it would. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. There was nothing unusual about the weather. The sea was calm. The sky was clear. The lighthouse stood exactly as it always had. Yet by the end of that day, everything had changed. The envelope bore the seal of the Maritime Authority. He had seen that seal hundreds of times over the years. Maintenance schedules, safety inspections, supply notices. This letter felt different before he even opened it. He carefully unfolded the pages. The message was respectful, formal, brief. After extensive evaluation, modernization of the station had been approved. Installation of the automated system will begin the following spring. His final day of service had already been scheduled. He read the letter twice, then a third time, not because he didn't understand it, because he had known this moment would eventually arrive. Yet somehow it still felt impossible. He folded the letter with the same care he used for every important document, then quietly placed it inside the top drawer of his desk. Outside, the sea continued breathing against the rocks. Nothing in nature acknowledged what had just happened. At sunset, he climbed the spiral staircase exactly as he always did. The lantern room greeted him with familiar silence. The great Fresnel lens reflected the fading light of the evening. He polished every panel, checked every gear, filled the oil reservoir, lit the lamp. The beam swept across the ocean, exactly on time. Duty did not pause for personal sorrow. During the following weeks, something curious happened. He began noticing details he had long taken for granted. The small crack in the eastern window frame, the smooth curve worn into the stone steps by generations of boots, the faint smell of warm brass after the lantern had burned for several hours, the way morning sunlight entered through the upper windows during winter. He realized he was quietly saying goodbye, not to a building, to a life. The supply captain sensed it immediately. "You got the letter?" It wasn't a question. The keeper nodded. The old captain removed his hat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the captain sighed. "I always hoped you'd be the last." The keeper smiled gently. "I suppose I am." Over the next several months, engineers arrived more frequently. New electrical equipment filled empty rooms. Control panels replaced old storage shelves. Modern batteries were installed beneath the tower. Computers appeared where handwritten logbooks had once been kept. The workers were respectful. Many of them genuinely admired the old lighthouse. Some even asked questions about its history. The keeper answered every one patiently. He held no bitterness toward them. They were not destroying his work. They were continuing it in a different form. One afternoon, a young technician watched him carefully polishing the enormous Fresnel lens. "You know," the young man said, "once the automation is finished, this lens won't need cleaning every day." The keeper smiled without stopping. "No, it won't." The technician hesitated. "Doesn't that bother you?" The keeper continued polishing. Finally he answered, "The purpose was never to keep me employed. The purpose was always to keep the light shining." The young technician looked down quietly. He never forgot that answer. As winter slowly gave way to spring, visitors began arriving more often. Not officials, not engineers. Former sailors, retired fishermen, Coast Guard officers, Word had quietly spread that one of the country's last traditional lighthouse keepers was retiring. Many arrived carrying old photographs. Others brought newspaper clippings. One elderly fisherman surprised him the most. Without saying a word, the man removed a faded black and white photograph from his pocket. It showed a small fishing boat battling enormous waves. The lighthouse stood in the background. I was on that boat, the fisherman said softly. The keeper studied the photograph. I don't remember. The old fisherman smiled. I wouldn't. You never saw us. But we saw your light. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the fisherman quietly reached into another pocket. He placed a small brass compass on the table. It belonged to my father. He always said we owed our lives to this lighthouse. I'd like you to have it. The keeper looked at the compass, then gently pushed it back. No, it belongs in your family. The fisherman smiled sadly. It stayed in our family because of yours. The keeper lowered his eyes. It was one of the very few moments in his life when he struggled to find words. As the weeks passed, more visitors came. Some simply wanted to shake his hand. Others stood silently looking out across the sea. A few asked questions. Many asked none. The lighthouse itself seemed to speak loudly enough. On the final Sunday before the automation team was due to arrive permanently, he attended the small church in his childhood village for the first time in years. Many people recognized him immediately. Some had grown old alongside him. Others were children when he had last seen them. The priest welcomed him warmly. After the service, an elderly woman approached. She introduced herself quietly. You probably don't remember my husband. He was captain of the Margaret and... The keeper searched his memory. There had been hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors. She smiled gently. You shouldn't remember. But he always remembered you. He used to say... She paused, holding back tears. That every time he saw the lighthouse, he knew someone was waiting to make sure he came home. She reached out and squeezed his hand, then simply walked away. He remained standing outside the church for several minutes, looking toward the distant coastline. From there, he could just barely see the lighthouse, a tiny white tower against the endless blue sea. For the first time in decades, he looked at it not as its keeper, but as one more person grateful that it existed. The morning of his final week arrived without ceremony. No crowds gathered at the harbor. No newspaper reporters waited outside the lighthouse. The sea looked exactly as it had thousands of mornings before. Calm, patient, unconcerned with human endings. He woke before sunrise, as he always had. For a few quiet moments, he remained seated on the edge of his bed, listening. The familiar rhythm of the waves below, the distant cries of seabirds, the soft ticking of the old clock mounted on the wall, sound that had accompanied him for nearly 4 decades. Soon, they would belong to someone else, or perhaps to no one at all. He dressed slowly, not because age had made him weak, but because he wanted to remember every ordinary detail. The weight of the lantern keys in his pocket, the rough texture of his old wool sweater, the smell of coffee drifting through the small kitchen. These simple moments suddenly felt precious. That morning, instead of beginning with maintenance, he climbed directly to the lantern room. The sun had not yet risen. The great Fresnel lens stood quietly before him, still glowing faintly after guiding ships through another long night. He gently placed one hand upon the cool brass frame. For almost 40 years, this had been his first stop every morning. He smiled softly. Good morning. No one heard the words. He wasn't speaking to the machinery. He was greeting an old friend. As daylight slowly replaced darkness, he carefully extinguished the great lamp one final time. The flame disappeared. Silence filled the room. It was a routine he had repeated thousands of times. Yet this morning, it felt entirely different. Over the following days, government workers continued preparing the automation system. Electronic controls replaced manual switches. Backup generators were tested. Sensors were calibrated. Everything was progressing according to schedule. The young lead engineer often watched the keeper work. Finally, curiosity overcame him. May I ask you something? Of course. After all these years, What are you going to do? The keeper looked out across the sea before answering. I honestly don't know. The engineer seemed surprised. I thought you'd already made plans. The old man smiled. For 40 years, my plans were made every morning. The young engineer understood. Some professions end with retirement. Others become part of a person's identity. How does someone retire? From being who they are? 2 days before his final shift, he unlocked a small wooden chest that had remained beneath his bed for decades. Inside rested everything he had chosen to keep. His grandfather's compass, his mother's letters, his father's short notes, his nephew's childhood drawing, the photograph taken by the young photographer years earlier, his journals, 40 years of journals. He carefully stacked them one by one. Dozens of weathered notebooks, thousands of handwritten pages, storms, repairs, sunrises, loneliness, hope, small observations that no official report had ever considered important. He ran his fingers across the worn leather covers. Together, they contained almost an entire lifetime. That afternoon, he received one final unexpected visitor, the young reporter who had filmed the documentary years earlier. Only now, the young man had gray beginning to show at his temples. Time had changed both of them. I wanted to see you before. He never finished the sentence. The keeper simply smiled. I'm glad you came. The reporter looked around the lighthouse. It feels smaller than I remembered. The keeper laughed quietly. It hasn't changed. We have. For several hours they talked, not as reporter and subject, simply as two men sharing memories. Before leaving, the reporter asked one final favor. Would you mind if I took one last photograph? The keeper nodded. A few minutes later, he stood on the outer gallery as the evening sun bathed the lighthouse in golden light. One hand rested gently on the iron railing. Behind him, the lantern room. Before him, the endless sea. The camera's shutter clicked. Just once, the reporter lowered his camera. I think, he said quietly, people are finally beginning to understand what lighthouse keepers meant. The keeper smiled. I hope they understand the lighthouse. The keeper isn't the important part. The reporter shook his head gently. I think you're wrong. That evening, after the visitor departed, the keeper climbed the stairs once more. He lit the lamp. The familiar beam swept across the darkening sea. Ships answered with distant navigation lights, exactly as they always had. Near midnight, he opened his journal. For a long time, he simply stared at the blank page. Finally, he began writing. Tomorrow will be my final full night. He stopped, looked toward the turning beam, then continued. I have often wondered whether I gave too much of my life to this place. Another pause. His pen rested quietly against the paper. Then he wrote the final sentence. But every life safely returned to shore reminds me that some things are worth giving your life to. He closed the journal. Outside, the lighthouse continued sending its faithful beam across the sleeping ocean. One more night, one more watch, one more promise kept. His final day began exactly like his first. Before sunrise, before the gulls, before the world beyond the sea had awakened. Some habits become so deeply woven into a person's life that they continue without thought. He climbed the spiral staircase slowly, not because he was reluctant, because he wanted to remember every step. The stone beneath his boots had been worn smooth by generations of keepers. Some of those footsteps belonged to men whose names had already disappeared from history. Soon, his own footsteps would join theirs. When he reached the lantern room, dawn was only beginning to brighten the eastern horizon. The great Fresnel lens stood silently before him. Its polished glass reflected the first faint light of morning. He reached into his pocket and removed the soft cloth he had carried almost every day for 40 years. Without speaking, he began polishing the brass frame one final time. Every movement was slow, deliberate, respectful. This was no longer maintenance. It was farewell. By mid-morning, the engineering team arrived. The lead engineer greeted him warmly. Everything is ready. The keeper nodded. I thought it would be. Together they performed the final inspection. Emergency batteries, control panels, automatic lamp ignition, weather sensors, remote monitoring equipment. Every system operated perfectly. Technology had done exactly what it had promised. It could keep the light burning, without a keeper. The realization brought him an unexpected sense of peace. For years he had feared that replacing the keeper meant abandoning the lighthouse. Now he understood the truth. The lighthouse itself would live on. Only its way of serving would change. That afternoon, the official from the Maritime Authority arrived carrying several documents. Most were simple administrative forms. One required his signature, confirming the transfer of responsibility. He signed without hesitation. 40 years, reduced to a single signature. The official carefully placed the papers inside his briefcase before looking toward the lantern room. I know this probably isn't enough. He began quietly. But thank you. The keeper smiled. You don't owe me thanks. The official shook his head. I think we do. Near sunset, everyone except the keeper quietly left the lantern room. Without discussing it, they all understood. The final lighting belonged to him alone. The room fell completely silent. Outside, the western sky glowed deep orange as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the sea. For the last time, he prepared the great lamp. He checked the fuel, adjusted the wick, inspected the mechanism, exactly as he had done thousands of evenings before. Then, with steady hands, he struck the match. The small flame caught immediately. Seconds later, the magnificent Fresnel lens gathered the light and projected it across the ocean one final time under his care. The beam slowly completed its first rotation. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. He watched quietly. There were no dramatic speeches, no tears, only gratitude. As night settled over the coastline, he remained beside the lantern for several hours. One by one, familiar ships appeared on the horizon. Fishing boats, cargo vessels, a Coast Guard cutter. Perhaps none of them knew this would be his final night. Perhaps some did. It no longer mattered. The light still reached them all. Shortly before midnight, something unexpected happened. Far across the dark water, a cargo ship sounded its horn. One long blast, then another. Moments later, a fishing boat answered. Then another. Soon, from different parts of the sea, several ships sounded their horns one after another. Deep voices rolling across the water. Some near, some distant, some barely audible beyond the waves. The engineer standing downstairs looked toward the official. What are they doing? The older official smiled quietly. They know. No announcement had been made. No newspaper had published the date. Yet, somehow, the sailors had found out. One final salute, not to the building, to the man who had kept its light alive. The keeper stood motionless beside the lantern. His eyes remained fixed upon the dark sea. He never waved. He simply listened. One horn after another echoing across the night. It lasted only a few minutes. Then silence returned. It was the most beautiful farewell anyone could have given him. Not applause, not medals, not speeches. Only the voices of ships safely crossing the waters he had watched over for 40 years. Just before dawn, the automation sequence was activated for the first time. The engineer carefully explained each step. The keeper listened politely, though there was very little left to explain. At precisely 6 o'clock, the control panel quietly assumed responsibility. The lantern continued operating exactly as before. Nothing changed. The beam still turned. The mechanism still worked. The sea still answered. Only one thing was different. For the first time in generations, no human hands guided the light. The keeper removed the heavy ring of brass keys from his pocket. Each key carried decades of use. He looked at them for a long moment, then gently placed them into the engineer's waiting hand. I believe these belong to history now. The young engineer closed his fingers around them carefully. I'll take good care of them. The keeper smiled. I know you will. He picked up his single suitcase, the very same one he had carried 40 years earlier. It looked older now. So did its owner. Together, they slowly descended the spiral staircase, step after step, until they reached the heavy wooden door at the base of the tower. He paused, turned once more, looked back up toward the endless staircase disappearing into darkness above, then quietly whispered, "Keep shining." With that, He stepped outside. For the first time in 40 years, he walked away from the lighthouse without looking back. For the first time in 40 years, he woke to silence that did not belong to the lighthouse. There were no stone walls surrounding him, no spiral staircase waiting to be climbed, no lantern room above his head, no familiar rhythm of waves striking the rocks beneath his bedroom. He had returned to the small village where his journey had begun. The same harbor still faced the sea. The same church bells still marked the hours. But everything else had changed. New houses stood where empty fields once stretched. Children rode bicycles through streets that had once been dirt paths. Fishing boats were larger, engines quieter. The world had moved forward, while he had remained faithfully beside the lighthouse. At first, retirement felt almost unreal. Each morning his body still woke before dawn. His hands instinctively searched for the heavy ring of brass keys that no longer hung beside his bed. More than once, he caught himself preparing to climb stairs that no longer existed. Old habits do not disappear simply because a calendar says they should. Several weeks passed before he finally visited the lighthouse again. This time, not as its keeper, as a visitor. The supply captain, now retired himself, offered to take him there one calm spring morning. Neither man spoke much during the journey. There was no need. Some friendships are built over so many years that silence becomes its own language. As the boat approached the rocky island, the lighthouse looked exactly as he remembered. White walls, black lantern, the same steady beams sweeping across the sea. Only now, the landing platform seemed strangely unfamiliar. For decades it had been the doorway to his home. Today, it belonged to memory. The young engineer greeted him warmly. "We've been hoping you'd come." The keeper smiled politely. "I wanted to see how she was doing." The engineer laughed softly. "She's doing exactly what you taught us." Inside, everything looked remarkably familiar. The stone walls remained unchanged. The old wooden staircase still creaked beneath every step. The great Fresnel lens still dominated the lantern room with quiet dignity. Only the control equipment had changed. Modern monitors displayed information once recorded by hand. Electronic sensors quietly measured conditions that generations of keepers had judged with experience alone. The engineer noticed the old man's eyes studying every detail. "We tried not to change anything we didn't have to." The keeper nodded gratefully. "You did well." Together, they climbed to the lantern room. For several long minutes, neither man spoke. The great lens continued turning smoothly. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. Exactly the same. The keeper rested one hand gently against the brass frame. It felt cool beneath his fingers, almost alive. The engineer finally broke the silence. "It still feels like you're supposed to be standing here." The old man smiled. "No." He looked toward the horizon. "It belongs to the next generation now." Before leaving, the engineer handed him a small package. Inside rested one of the original brass gears removed during modernization. It had become too worn for reliable service. "We thought," the young man said, "you should keep this." The keeper held the heavy gear carefully. Thousands of nights, millions of rotations, decades of faithful work, all contained within one simple piece of brass. He thanked the engineer quietly. It was the only souvenir he ever accepted from the lighthouse. Back in the village, life settled into a slower rhythm. He spent mornings walking along the harbor. Children occasionally recognized him from the old documentary. Tourists sometimes asked whether he had really lived alone inside the lighthouse. He always smiled. "I was never alone. The sea kept me company." People usually laughed. Only a few understood he was speaking sincerely. One summer afternoon, the local school invited him to speak to a group of students studying maritime history. He almost declined, then changed his mind. Standing before 30 curious children, he expected questions about storms, shipwrecks, danger. Instead, a little girl raised her hand. "Were you ever scared?" He smiled. "Many times." The classroom grew quiet. Another child asked, "Then why didn't you leave?" He looked around the room. Every young face waited patiently. Finally he answered, "Because somewhere beyond the horizon, Someone was counting on the light. The room remained silent. Years later, several of those children would remember that single sentence more clearly than the entire lesson. As time passed, his walks became shorter. His hair turned completely white. His hands, one so steady while tending delicate machinery, slowly began to tremble with age. Still, every clear evening, he carried a wooden chair onto the hill overlooking the sea. From there, he could see the lighthouse, tiny against the horizon, its beam still turning, night after night. Sometimes neighbors joined him. Sometimes he sat alone. He never missed an evening when the sky was clear. One autumn night, a young boy climbed the hill carrying a small telescope. "My grandfather says you used to work there." The old keeper smiled. "I did." The boy looked through the telescope toward the lighthouse. "It doesn't look lonely." The old man followed the beam with his eyes. "No," he said quietly, "it never was." The boy lowered the telescope. "Will people remember you?" The question lingered in the cool evening air. The old keeper looked toward the lighthouse for a long time before answering. "I hope they remember something better." "What?" "That whenever they saw that light, someone cared enough to keep it shining." The boy nodded thoughtfully. Neither of them spoke again. Far beyond the horizon, another ship quietly adjusted its course. Another family unknowingly moved one step closer to welcoming someone safely home. The lighthouse continued doing exactly what it had always done, and the old keeper, watching from the hillside, realized he had never truly left it behind. The final winter of his life arrived quietly. There were no dramatic illnesses, no sudden tragedies, only the gentle passage of time that eventually comes for everyone. By then, walking the hill overlooking the sea required a wooden cane. His steps had become slower, his shoulders slightly bent. Yet every clear evening, if the weather allowed, he still made the familiar journey. Neighbors had grown accustomed to the sight. The old lighthouse keeper, sitting alone on the weathered bench, watching the beam sweep across the horizon. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness, exactly as it had done for generations. People often assumed he was remembering the past. The truth was different. He wasn't looking backward. He was making sure the light was still there. One afternoon, a fierce storm rolled across the coast, the strongest in several years. Rain lashed against the village windows. The wind bent trees almost to the ground. Many residents remained indoors, listening as the sea roared beyond the cliffs. The old keeper stood beside his window. He never once questioned whether the lighthouse would survive. He knew those walls. He knew every stone, every iron beam, every window. He trusted them as one trusts an old friend. That evening, despite the storm, the familiar beam continued crossing the darkness. He smiled quietly. Some promises outlive the people who make them. Several weeks later, he opened the wooden chest beneath his bed one final time. Inside rested the object that had accompanied him through nearly his entire life, his grandfather's compass, the brass gear given to him after retirement, the photograph of his nephew's childhood drawing, the old documentary, and 40 years of journals. He lifted the first notebook, then the last. He smiled at how different the handwriting had become. The early pages belonged to a young man eager to prove himself. The later ones belonged to someone who had stopped trying to prove anything. He spent the afternoon reading random entries. A terrible storm from 27 years earlier. The day seals covered the rocks. The cargo ship saved by emergency light signals. The evening dozens of ships sounded their horns in farewell. So many ordinary days. That together had become an extraordinary life. Near sunset, he began writing once more. His hands trembled now. Each word required patience. Still, he continued, if someone finds these journals someday... He paused, listening to the distant sound of the sea through the open window, then wrote again. Do not remember me because I lived alone. Another pause. Remember the thousands of people who never knew they were protected. He smiled. That sentence felt right. He kept writing. Lighthouses were never monuments to the men inside them. They were promises. A promise that someone would remain awake, so others could sleep. a promise that someone would remain standing so others could return home. When he finally reached the bottom of the page, he carefully signed his name for the first time in decades. He wrote it in full, not because history needed to know it, but because his family might. He gently closed the journal. It was a final entry. The following spring, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. The village church bells rang softly that morning. News traveled quietly through the harbor, among fishermen, Coast Guard crews, retired sailors, former lighthouse workers. No national newspaper carried the story. No television crews arrived. History continued moving forward, just as it always had. Several days later, his nephew opened the wooden chest exactly as his uncle had requested. Inside lay every journal, every photograph, every carefully preserved letter. Resting on top was a sealed envelope. Its handwriting had faded with age. Across the front were only 6 simple words. For whoever keeps the light next. The envelope was delivered to the Lighthouse. The young engineer who had overseen its automation opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. It read, "Technology will make this lighthouse stronger. Take good care of it. But never forget." Ships trusted the light. People trusted the ones who protected it. May neither ever be taken for granted. No signature followed. None was necessary. The engineer quietly folded the page. He placed it inside the control room, beside the old maintenance logs, where it remains to this day. Years passed. Visitors came from around the world. Many admired the magnificent Fresnel lens. Others photographed the breathtaking cliffs. Children pointed excitedly toward the great white tower rising above the sea. Most never asked who had lived there. Some did. When they did, the guides would sometimes tell the story of the quiet keeper who had spent 40 years making sure strangers reached home safely, not because he sought recognition, but because he believed responsibility was its own reward. Today, if you stand on that same coastline after sunset, you'll still see the beam cross in the darkness. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness, exactly as it did decades ago. The machinery has changed. The world has changed. The people have changed. But the promise remains. Somewhere, someone is still depending on that light. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the old lighthouse keeper left behind. The world remembers explorers, captains, inventors, kings. But every great journey has always depended on someone whose name history almost forgot. If this story reminded you that quiet acts of duty can change countless lives, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we remember the people history nearly left behind, because without them, history itself would have looked very different.